Hi everybody, I'm Jake from Jams and Tea, and today we're going to talk about the discography of one of my favorite bands, Cocteau Twins. Cocteau Twins was formed in 1981 in the UK by Elizabeth Fraser, Robin Guthrie, and founding member Will Heggie, though Will departed from the band in 1983 and was replaced with mainstay Simon Raymond until their final record in 1997. Of the many bands that emerged out of the post-punk wave of the late 70s and early 80s that yielded a sort of nebulous gothic sound, such as The Cure or Susie and the Banshees, which blended bits of post-punk and new wave and dream pop together, I feel that Cocteau Twins are paradoxically both kind of ubiquitous and quite underrated, in that they certainly get their laurels in the world of alternative music and have a few canonical records under their belt, but they also seem to be remembered for just some of their peak moments, instead of the litany of fantastic releases over the years that proved to be some of the most idiosyncratic and enduring entries in their genre, with the spectral, often indecipherable lyrics of the voice of Liz Fraser, and the surprisingly muscular, innovative production work from within the band. In terms of ranking these albums, it's kind of a difficult task, because the gap in quality between releases is very thin. But that said, I wanted to pay tribute to the band as best as I can, and while I do want to put my opinion on these albums and this ranking out there, I would also like to guide some fans who have maybe only heard one or two of these albums into becoming full-fledged fanatics, such as myself. Now, I will be covering my thoughts on their full studio discography, including the compilation The Pink Opaque, as well as the full album collaboration with ambient music legend Harold Budd. But don't think that's the limit of this band's material. Like many other shoegaze and dream pop bands of this particular era, Cocteau Twins have plenty of EPs and compilations that are absolutely 100% worth checking out in their entirety, and not just for completionists, but for people who just want more from this band. So, without further ado, starting off my list, we have the band's first album, 1982's Garlands, and fret not, as I know many have a soft spot for the debut record here, which is not at the bottom of this list because I think it's a bad or even weak release. I'll say that up front, Cocteau Twins do not have a bad release, and considering their proper studio discography spans 14 years with a fairly consistent release schedule, that's particularly impressive. When I tell you that the top half of this list equates to little more than personal preference, I really mean it. Perhaps more so than with previous discographies I've covered, like Sweet Trip. Can you tell I like shoegaze? But regardless, I don't want its placement here to suggest that Garlands isn't worth your time. It absolutely is. Like every Cocteau Twins album, this has stunning highs like Wax and Wane, Blind Dumb Deaf, and Shallow the Halo, which are essentially songs that I think most fans would say belong right up there with other beloved tracks. Like basically every album this band put out, it's a tight record with a consistent track list that's scant runtime manages to still feel sprawling and substantial. That said, there are a few reasons I would place it here lower than other fans might. Seeing as this was the debut, the Cocteau Twins' sound hasn't fully formed itself yet, so the band opt for a more traditionally gothic post-punk sound. It's far more enveloping than its contemporaries, but it still doesn't quite contain the spark, energy, or depth of even the record they would release in the following year. You can feel the influences of the 80s looming on this project, as tracks like the aforementioned Wax and Wane contain an anxious groove and tense bass line that sounds not a million miles away from New Order or Talking Heads. It's very much the start of a band that are still in progress, and while you can't expect a totally realized sound from a band right out of the gate, it does inevitably lead this record to feeling more primitive and of its genre, even if it still has a great grasp of the fundamentals. The album's biggest weakness, though, for me, is that its highlights can be found on those compilations and EPs that I mentioned in my intro. And in most cases, I prefer those songs on those projects, even if I don't think anything on this album even approaches bad or mediocre. It's still perhaps the most menacing and angsty record the band ever put out, which I think does have some value in hindsight. Overall, Garlands isn't a terrible place to start with this band, as you can chart their trajectory very easily if you get into them chronologically. don't expect them to be confined by these limitations, however, or even for them to elaborate on this darker tone, as I think it's inarguable that the band would go on to make albums that revel in sounds that dwell between distinct moods, to create soundscapes and songs that feel more emotionally complex than this. And thus, this does lose a little bit of what I find to be appealing about Cocteau Twins in general. That said, it is still an essential listen. Yet again, I find myself having to play devil's advocate for both sides here, seeing as I need to justify this album's placement as lower in my ranking, but I also know that many people see the final two Cocteau Twins albums as being unfairly maligned. I mean, maligned is going a bit too far. These albums were, and still are, received very well, but I think it's undeniable that the two other 90s records from the band inevitably hang in the long shadow cast by Heaven or Las Vegas, which isn't fair. Milk and Kisses here is the final release from the band in 1996, closing out their fantastic run of records. And while I would actually say that this record doesn't contain the same highs as Garlands does, I deem it to be the superior record because the floor for this record is a little bit higher. Even at its least essential moments, it still carries over the bright, shimmery pop sensibility of the two records before it, which brim with tracks that have a kind of lush momentum that makes you feel almost blindsided as you experience them in real time. This is showcased no better than the album highlight for me, second track, Serpent Skirt. This tonal outlier that sounds like Liz's vocals are blended seamlessly with an instrumental that wouldn't be out of place on something like Angelo Badalamenti's score for Twin Peaks. Also go to bat for Seekers Who Were Lovers being one of the best closers that the band has. If anything, the reason Milk and Kisses is so low here is that, like Garlands, it's more about where this stands in the artistic canon of the band rather than being about a difference in substantial quality. Whereas the debut felt a bit too of its time, Milk and Kisses sees the band painting themselves into a bit of a corner. After Heaven in Las Vegas, the band didn't really do too much to alter their sound beyond that, and while far from a bad thing, it can lead to the two albums that follow up one of their masterpieces to being little more than more of the same, but the same quality is still great. It simply leads to a less distinct listening experience, but hell, the disparity in quality between this crop of songs and the crop of songs and later entries in this list, it's really not that much, frankly. If you gave this a listen before some of the more recognized releases from the band, I could easily see how this could be a dark horse pick for your favorite. As to what I stand personally, it could grow on me in the future, but it does feel like a release that, while essential, remains sonically redundant within their own catalog. Now, I already kind of alluded to my thoughts on this record in the last entry, as this is the 1993 follow-up to Heaven or Las Vegas, and the penultimate record in their discography. And as such, almost everything I said about Milk and Kisses is more or less applicable here. That said, what exactly makes this the stronger release? Well, for starters, it's, again, not by much, but I think this is certainly the riskier album. Be it the swirling psychedelia of the opener, Know Who You Are at Every Age, that features almost REM-style jangle pop guitars, or the wonderful timeless guitar melodies created on Evangeline, this album threatens to break new ground from the band, but doesn't quite push their sound in enough of a consistent direction for me to say it's a step forward at the same time. Like Milk and Kisses, this is another comparatively pop-oriented release from the band that focuses on the raw power of how thick the patented Cocteau Twins atmosphere could become when the instrumentals were blown up and made as loud and fiery as possible. This sounds like these later albums are aggressive or heavy by the way I'm describing them, and they really aren't, as this is only speaking relatively within the band's catalog. The other reason I confidently place it above Milk and Kisses is that I just think this has the better crop of songs, especially that opening 3-track run, which is just marvelous in my opinion. If it suffers from anything, it does feel like both of these final two records revel in how almost saccharine the band's sound can be, and while I enjoy that side of the band, it does abandon a certain sonic nuance that I miss from records previous. That said, this is an album that deserves far better than the unassuming reputation that it has. Here we have what is easily my hottest take on Cocteau Twins' catalog as a whole, and I implore you to hear me out. Like I keep saying, the difference between this album and everything above it is marginal at best, especially with the other 3 records out of the way. And I do have my reasons, but I know this is seen by many as the band's defining masterpiece, 1984's Treasure. And while you may have already grabbed your pitchforks and begun sharpening them, I still have no shortage of good things to say about this album. If you're looking for an album that contains a singular load of plainly great songs, you will find few better places to look than Treasure, as many individual tracks here are among the band's most cherished. Lorelei, Dynamo, Aloysius, Pandora, this simply contains the largest amount of perfect songs of the 3 records they had made thus far. Where Treasure might falter, for me anyway, is in its construction as an album experience. This does have the most distinctly defined aesthetic of any record they've made thus far, as their post-punk roots are barely even visible here, and instead their embrace of dream pop and ethereal wave starts out precisely opposite of where it ends. Treasure is a frigid, icy, crystalline record adorned with far more instrumental detail than what comes before it, and there's a lot to enjoy from that. However, I don't think they entirely hit the mark all the way quite just yet, as Treasure's sonic aesthetic feels a bit well-worn. While it's not a long record, it is still an album where I think some trimming probably would have benefited, as it doesn't feel as tightly constructed as many of their other records. Tracks like Otterly, Beatrix, and Sisterly are good, but certainly on a lower tier than the heavenly heights of the rest of the record, and can lead this to feeling somewhat languid and monotone. The other weakness here is that if I'm being totally truthful, I don't always care for Liz's vocal presence on this album. She is normally a wonderful vocalist who uses her voice like most important instruments in these incredibly dense mixes, guiding you along these colorful worlds with performances and melodies that are captivating, catchy, and emotional, even if you can't understand a single word of what she's saying. On here, I think she might be trying a little bit too much to sound like Kate Bush, and sometimes when she hits the top of her register, it grates on me in a way it doesn't on any other album here. I know many people probably enjoy the particular eccentricity of the vocals on here, but for me, they kind of tear a hole in some of the atmosphere, especially on the first half. While it does have its issues for me personally, and while it does feel a little lopsided when it comes to quality overall, Treasure is yet another great record that deserves a great reputation, but if you find yourself exploring this album early on in your journey with this band, don't sweat it if you aren't filled with the overwhelming love for it that its reputation suggests. It is perhaps what I would deem sonically transitional, but I think many would debate it benefits from this more than it suffers, just not me personally. Now, this one is a little weird, I will admit. Cocteau Twins have a bunch of great secondary releases, so why exactly did I zero in on this one specifically? Well, I think that it arguably is held in just as high esteem as the upper tier records from the band, even far above the other compilations and EPs that are, bare minimum, great. Well, I put it here half to represent that this band's main discography goes beyond the studio albums, and half because this feels like the most cohesive project that can still be listened to as an album experience that hangs together. This compilation takes B-sides, unreleased songs, and songs from EPs and puts them into one 40-minute record, and honestly, this track list is positively tantalizing. I think that no true Cocteau Twins fan can fault me for wanting to include this, seeing as it includes the band's most beloved song, Pearly Dewdrops Drop, which is enough merit alone to land it this high. We also have the Spangle Maker, Lorelei, Musette and Drums, Ikai Guinea, and Millinary. I mean, my god, this feels like cheating. And let's be honest, it kind of is. Putting songs that are just so beloved as singles and B-sides into one mythical release is basically just a greatest hits compilation. The only difference here is that they weren't hits, but they are in theory, I guess. Regardless of how consistently amazing this is, and how it does feel like it holds together as its own project, I won't lie and tell you that it's flawless, as I think the fabric that holds this together isn't quite as tightly woven as the other albums, so to speak, but it's a minor complaint that I can't be asked to care about when actually listening to this, which I do fairly frequently. A bit of a cheat code, but arguably one of the most essential releases from the band. Period. Now, the reason that I rank this over Treasure, despite it being debatably less indicative of the band's overall distinct and multifaceted sound, I think it's inarguable that their pivot from traditional genre sounds into what we know as the Cocteau Twins didn't truly happen until they followed up Treasure with another album that we'll talk about later, and thus leads this to be stuck with the loathsome transitional label, even though I think it should be shared with Treasure, but that's more semantics than anything else. Like I frequently say on the podcast, being transitional is a neutral descriptor. It could be a positive or a negative given the context. Here, I think this is a classic example of a record fully benefiting from those qualities, and what we end up getting is Garlands but fully realized in a bigger, louder, more interesting package. This isn't to imply that this album is a kind of black sheep or anything. People tend to love it. But when it comes to the overall consensus, I think a lot of people just don't know what to do with it, since it is a marked improvement over the debut, but occupies a sort of awkward stage in their creative identity. What Head Over Heels does is aim the band in the right direction, and ends up using the post-punk sound as little more than instrumental aesthetic, as these songs feel far more in keeping with what the band would do much later when it comes to their song structure and how each instrument is produced within their mixes. This is essentially post-punk if the core ethos was to blow up every instrument and make it sound as loud and enormous as humanly possible, and it creates an album with a distinct edge that just adds to its appeal. All this is to say, it's incredibly unique, and it contains an impeccable crop of songs. 5-10-50-fold, Musette and drums, Sugar Hiccup, and the terrifically underrated Glass Candle Grenades make for a show-stopping tracklist that just never lets up. In my eyes, this is their first proper masterpiece, even if it sounds a little bit more like Susie and the Banshees than it does Cocteau Twins. This is another one of the albums in this discography that I know is beloved, but sits in a place that's clearly building up to the most significant release they would come out with. So it gets hugely underrepresented as the masterful turn that it is. Bluebell Knoll is a record that takes literally everything that its predecessors did, and combines it all together and creates what I think is the definitive arrival for the Cocteau Twins, as this sound is quintessentially born from every disparate element you could find on the records before it. And thus this can prove kind of an intimidating first listen, especially if you go in chronological order. This is easily the brightest and most direct album from the band so far, and it comes right after two releases that focus way more on mood and density. There are often primitive-sounding drum machines and electronic beats at the start of these songs that become almost instantly swallowed by vast caverns of dreamy shoegaze. It's an odd choice I didn't always understand, but I feel now that it's a conscious attempt to get the listener to appreciate the weight and dynamism of their sound, presenting the sonic equivalent of a blank sheet of paper and then proceeding to violently throw a can of paint on that paper, smearing it into an abstract haze. It's also kind of tough to knock a record with stuff like the title track, Carolyn's Fingers, Athol's Rose, or A Kissed Out Red Float Boat, wild titles on this one, that all hit with a depth and immediacy in a combination not quite yet seen. While it is a largely bigger and more pop-oriented release, it still has more stately, dreamlike moments that draw from the previous two records, and thus feels like maybe the definitive place to start with this band, as I think this is also where Liz's incredibly singular vocal delivery and melodies are simultaneously at their most eccentric, but without being grating like they could on Treasure, and thus give you a great idea of what to expect from this band overall, without diving right into the more beloved and acclaimed release that would follow it with an experience that is nearly on par, in my opinion, but has the added bonus of being a record that I think sort of teaches the listener how to best enjoy this band purely by hearing it, which is where its genius truly lies. Finally, after having to allude to it so much, here we have the definitive release from Cocteau Twins. By some margin, this is the classic this band will be remembered for, and with good reason. It's a masterpiece. I know some diehards might be miffed that my placement here only just breaks the margin of this band's holy trinity, but I stand by it. Really, when it comes to this band, and a lot of the genres that they dabble in, it's all about what you're looking for. And in many respects, it's easy to see why exactly this is the fan favorite. This is a bold, innovative step forward from the direction of Bluebell Knoll, where they dial up the eccentricity, creativity, and overall shine of the sound. This is, quite simply, the best produced album of the 1990s, a claim I do not make lightly. walls of incandescent, unrecognizable guitars and synths that blend into a white-hot atmosphere of simmering sound that make this entire experience emphasize the dream in dream pop. We get more of Liz's expressive vocal hooks that feel perfectly pronounced in the mix, never lost or adrift, but always difficult to fully nail down, that makes re-listening to this truly kind of a treat. The way these sounds pan back and forth is a marvel, and from the very start of Cherry Colored Funk, you're already sailing into the sunset. It's an album that feels more tightly controlled and accessible in its first half, but still slowly dissolves so that by the time you get to the absolute perfection of the title track, you feel the sonic disintegration that the record begins to unfold in, as these songs become more and more structureless exercises in making this sound as far-reaching and vast as possible. This is the closest to fully fledged shoegaze the band would ever come, and my only complaint I can throw at this excellent discography is that I wish that element was expanded upon in the final two records. Underrated deep cuts on this one, though, are in the back half, like I Wear Your Ring, the infinitely catchy Road, River, and Rail, and the absolute crown jewel of Frou Frou Foxes and Midsummer Fire. Actually, that kind of brings up the point that I kind of prefer the back half of this album than I do the front half, though that particular opinion took some time to develop. I can't really say a word wrong about Heaven or Las Vegas, save for the fact that I do prefer one half of the other. But that distinction only comes from my obsessive amount of listening. A well-deserved classic. But this could also be seen as somewhat controversial, as this album is well-liked, but generally one of the less popular releases from the band overall. But those who know me know that this entry in the catalog was going to be a slam dunk because of the name of the collaborator on this 1986 venture into full-on ambient soundscapes. The name, of course, being Harold Budd. Today, Budd is by some measure my favorite ambient musician, and one of my favorites in general, as his work alongside ambient legend Brian Eno, and his continued partnership with Robin Guthrie after this collaboration, like the soundtrack to Greg Araki's masterpiece Mysterious Skin, a film that prominently features the music of Cocteau Twins and Sigur Rós, as well as projects like Before the Day Breaks and After the Night Falls, all make him to be one of the most respected and beloved figures in all of music. His trademark careful layering of synths, electric pianos, and soothing aesthetic make him an absolutely genius choice to collaborate with for an ambient dream pop record like this one, as he'd already dabbled in a similar palette with the Pavilion of Dreams, but in my opinion, this record sees that project's ideas taken to a further, bolder extent, while still retaining more than enough of the band's core sound. This may be a shift in genre, but the sound, production, and palette is only expanded from here on out, and I think is essential to understanding how they would take their sound after this, by using the same principles with an opposite technique. On later albums they asked, what if we made it louder? And here they ask, what if we made it softer? There is certainly plenty of traditional Cocteau Twins material to enjoy. The opener See Swallow Me features a sublime combination of those textural pianos and layered guitars to create a hypnotic effect. Liz's vocal performance here is also dizzying. This familiar material is immediately complemented by Memory Gongs, a more sinister, open, vaguely exploratory sound that feels as though you're floating through the universe. An ambient bed of Cocteau Twins sounds, lost inside of a Harold Budd soundscape. The more experimental highlight of the record is the sublime Why Do You Love Me? A distant wailing guitar is submerged in a vast ocean of looping piano melodies to create one of the most purely beautiful things this band, or any band, would ever create. A brilliant reprieve from the more ominous second track. After this, you'll be once again treated to the more traditional fare of Eyes Are Mosaics with some lovely, satisfying percussion, Liz's ascending vocal harmonies, and a generally more upbeat tone. The way this album flows and ebbs between different levels of energy, instrumental and emotional tones, and generally incredibly varied styles of song from this unique blend of atmospheric dream pop and ambient music is nothing short of astounding, and I think more than justifies my placement of it as one of the band's absolute standout works, as it contains both flavors of the Cocteau Twins sound when it comes to pop and more stately ambience, and blends it with something totally unique and all its own because of its phenomenal collaboration choice. The saxophone at the end of She Will Destroy You forecasts the use of horns on the 7-minute The Ghost Has No Home, an otherworldly piece of unmatched beauty that feels like a resolution to the restless quality this album contains, a warmer, much more comforting cousin to memory gongs. This album has one fault, it's the briefness of Bloody and Blunt, a gorgeous song that's unfortunately a scant 2 minutes, and it kind of feels as though it would benefit from extending its runtime, as soaking in this song feels difficult when the closer comes barreling forward at the end. Thankfully, it ends on as strong of a note as what it came before it, with a dynamic and fascinating track that's adorned with muted shoegaze guitars at the start until its unprecedented final third just kind of climaxes with an explosion that's one of the most beautiful instrumental rises in this whole discography. Thus ends what is, by my own estimation, the most underrated project from this band, and one that contains more than its singular niche appeal as a side project or collaboration, as this deserves to be in with the canon of the band just as much as anything else. But perhaps the least immediate record in the Cocteau Twins catalog, Victoria Land was always an album I had an affinity for, but became a record that, with time, I revisited the most. It is certainly their most sedentary record in terms of how much energy it contains, but like the Moon and the Melodies, this gets a lot of mileage out of still managing to balance out the more ethereal moments with more traditional elements of the band, but still assumes its own unique identity amidst it all. The album begins with, in my opinion, the best opener this band has, Lazy Calm. The synths and gentle guitar chords reverberate and cascade like water, gently shimmering until the muted but still quite present saxophone is introduced. A warm instrumental tone that makes this opener feel like a warm blanket of comfort. And when the song proper begins, Liz's vocals feel almost lullaby-esque, which sets the stage well for Victoria Land as a whole. This is followed up by the more invigorating Fluffy Tufts, which feel playful and fun, like something you'd hear on a Kate Bush album, like The Sensual World, if you added a hell of a lot of reverb. The next track shows this album's multifaceted nature fantastically as the dark, sinister, throughout the dark months of April and May, which may as well be the blueprint of all gothic rock to come. Lycia basically owes their entire existence to this song, but it never overwhelms you. It's more unnerving, but still holds the listener at a bit of a distance, so that Victoria Land's palette never strays too far from being enveloping and soothing overall. This does lead to a lack of dynamism that many other records in this discography do contain, but I think that it's merely part and parcel of the experience. Those records like Bluebell Knoll, for instance, use this band's sound to be a shot in the arm of consistent color and excitement, where the dynamic structure adds to the sense of unpredictable wonder, whereas Victoria Land is calmer and much more focused on its own ambient bed of sounds to submerge you in. Both approaches are going to have various degrees of effectiveness on the listener, but I think this is where the geniusly tight album runtimes of this band help both approaches, as it emphasizes these elements without ever making you feel like either of these modes that these albums exist in get old. Victoria Land, as such, is 33 minutes of fascinating, dense, otherworldly sound, and to me becomes the most sonically exploratory album that they have. The textural quality that these songs have is something else, as it feels like I can almost reach out and touch songs like Feet Like Fins, making this the most vivid and vibrant listening experience. The Thinner Air ends the album as strongly as it begins, ending on a note so emotionally ambiguous that I never know quite how to feel exactly, which is part of its appeal. It's not an album that many are going to agree with me on as the band's best, even if it is well liked. It's just not the type of record to captivate everyone as overwhelmingly. That said, I stand resolute in my assessment, as I think it's this band's most impressive achievement in raw sound design. And sure, while it does favor the less energetic side of their sound, it's far from lethargic or patience-trying, because all of these songs are around the same length and feel so well paced. It's a careful art to make something so precise without making the experience of an album like this feel as though there are no surprises or sort of doesn't let the listener explore it on its own. But the balance of intentional design and breathing room, as well as it containing the most captivating core sound of any of their records with its saturated, sugary warmth, lead it to be my favorite of the band's catalog. Not by much, but still confidently. So, that is the discography of Cocteau Twins. Obviously, if you've got some opinions on this band or a ranking of your own, drop it in the comments below. I don't know how to end videos.